The Alpha Legion is not remembered in hymns or carved into triumphal arches. Their legacy does not rise in banners above conquered cities or echo in the voices of victorious soldiers. Their work begins where sight fails and ends where memory doubts itself. They are the legion that erases certainty, the blade hidden inside the sheath, the word whispered in the dark that reshapes entire campaigns without raising a single bolter. To speak of their missions is to step into a maze without walls, where every direction feels chosen for you before you set foot upon the path. In the Imperium, the Alpha Legion is not feared because of their strength in battle, but because even in their absence, one cannot know if the war being fought belongs to the Emperor or to them. Before we pull back the shroud on their designs, lend your strength to this channel. Like, share, and subscribe. Such support ensures that explorations of the galaxy's darkest corners continue to reach those who hunger for understanding, and keeps alive the search for truth in a universe where truth itself is never certain. The order came before dawn, when the trenches still reeked of damp earth and cold promethium smoke. Guardsmen stirred under the pale lamps strung along the dugouts, their breath fogging the chill air, and none questioned the command at first. A redeployment, a shift in the firing line, a tightening of ranks before the expected orc push. It was the kind of routine order that slipped into weary bones without protest. The Vox grill hissed, the words crackled with static, but the cadence was familiar enough to be obeyed. Men and women rose, adjusted flak armor straps, hefted lap. Only later would they remember that their commander had been dead for 2 days. Boots struck the frozen mud in rhythm, muffled by layers of grime and fatigue. Sergeant Arachin watched his section file into formation, their eyes sunken, faces masked by streaks of ash and dirt. They did not notice the silence between Vox clicks, the faint delay before the command was repeated, the hesitation that no true officer would ever allow. In the half-light, with gunmetal skies promising no dawn, obedience became the only warmth. He felt the weight of suspicion too late, a nagging itch at the back of his skull, as if he were moving in a dream someone else had written. The trenches were not silent. Not truly. Rats squeaked between ration crates. The distant thunder of artillery rolled like the memory of a storm, never reaching them yet, never absent. But amid that noise, there was an absence, the usual coughs, the crude jokes muttered between squads, the grounding familiarity of comrades speaking with the rough music of shared suffering. Tonight it was different. Voices were restrained, low, clipped. The order had stolen not only their direction, but their tongues, as if any sound louder than a whisper might reveal the lie at the heart of their march. When they reached the forward line, the confusion became more pronounced. Patrols already stationed there had received no redeployment command. Arguments sparked. Who had spoken first? Which Vox channel carried the order? Rachin watched his men waver, lasguns half lowered, staring at other guardsmen in identical armor, identical helmets, identical exhaustion. A wrong word, a sudden twitch, and they would have turned their weapons inward. Trust had thinned to a membrane, stretched until it might tear with the next breath. A single figure resolved through the haze, his armor marked with the insignia of command. His voice was steady, clipped, carrying the authority of drilled ritual. He confirmed the redeployment, smoothed the tension with the ease of command. Men lowered their weapons, doubt ebbed. For a heartbeat, the world steadied. Then, a young trooper, little more than a boy, whispered that he had watched the commander die in an explosion the week before. His words cut sharper than any blade. Eyes turned. The air thickened. The officer smiled. It was a small thing, that smile, but wrong in every detail. Too practiced, too precise. It lacked the weary bitterness of an officer who had spent his life in mud and death. The troops saw it together, and something primal stirred the recognition that the face before them belonged to the man they obeyed. Yet not the man at all. The lasguns rose again, this time trembling with both fear and conviction. The officer did not flinch. He simply raised his own weapon, and in that motion, RH understood. The first shot did not come from either side. It came from elsewhere, a bolt round tearing through the boy who had spoken, reducing his chest to ruin. Panic surged. The trench erupted in fire, soldiers shooting at shapes that looked like friends, at helmets that bore the same unit insignia, at shadows that returned fire with uncanny precision. The mud filled with blood, the lamps shattered, and in the chaos, no one knew who had fired first, or why. Arachon ducked low, pulling two of his men behind a slab of shattered ferrocrete. Over the din, he caught a glimpse of figures moving with grace, no guardsmen, possessed, taller, heavier, their armor shimmering in shades of cobalt and jade, as if the darkness itself bent to clothe them. They fired sparingly, never wasting a shot, each round tearing through loyalists who thought they were killing traitors. And still the Vox channels buzzed with commands that contradicted each other, urging the same men to advance, retreat, hold fire, unleash volleys. The Hydra had wound itself into their very discipline, using their obedience as the weapon that killed them. He pressed his face into the grit, tasting ash, feeling the vibration of impacts shudder through the earth. He remembered the boy's accusation, the officer's smile, and he knew the truth only when it was too late. They had not been following orders at all. They had been led into a performance, a stage where every word, every hesitation, every familiar gesture had been rehearsed. They were actors in a war whose script they had never seen. When the firing subsided, the trench was unrecognizable. The lamps were extinguished, the walls torn into jagged ruin, and the survivors stumbled in silence. Some wept openly, not from wounds, but from the certainty that they had killed their own. Others clutched at their weapons, as if holding the only anchor left in a sea of shifting truths. Rashawn rose, his ears ringing, his section scattered and broken. The Vox still crackled faintly in the distance, another order preparing to drag them further into the Hydra's coil. And in that hollow moment before dawn, as the first dull light tried and failed to pierce the smoke, Arachon understood the cost. Firepower meant nothing. Valor meant nothing. What mattered was trust, and trust had already been bled from them. The Hydra does not roar, it smiles. Its mouth is many, its face is countless, and each one wears the skin of someone you think you know. The Alpha Legion's strength lies not in charging walls or raising banners, but in dissolving the very certainty that such banners are worth following. They arrive not as conquerors, but as mirrors, catching light and bending it, until every soldier who gazes into them begins to doubt his own reflection. In the half-light of wars, their armor gleams like water shifting over stone. Blue one moment, green the next, indistinct in the eyes, yet precise in its intent. To see them moving at the edge of a battlefield is to question whether you saw anything at all. Some guardsmen whisper that the shimmer is unnatural, a trick of the warp that hides them in plain sight. Others insist it is nothing more than careful pigment, layered on silk. But all agree that what matters is not how the armor looks, but how the mind reacts when faced with it. To look upon them is to hesitate, and hesitation is death. The voice comes next, not the guttural roar of traitors who have long surrendered themselves to mutation, not the broken litany of heretics wrapped in madness. The Alpha Legion's voice is perfect. It matches cadence, tone, even the smallest hesitation of the one it imitates. Orders are given in familiar rhythm, the crackle of Vox interference masking what little difference might remain. The legionary speaks, and entire squads obey. It is not domination by fear, nor by faith, but by mimicry so complete that obedience flows without resistance. For the legionnaire, this is no easy feat. To wear the mask is to study it until it becomes indistinguishable from self. Months are spent learning not just words, but gestures, habits, the way a soldier shifts weight when weary, the flicker of irritation in his eyes when challenged. They are students of humanity in its smallest, most fragile details, and in that devotion to detail lies their paradox. For how long can a man live as another before the question of his own identity erodes? When Alpharius himself declared that each warrior was Alpharius, was it doctrine, or was it resignation to the reality that no one truly remembered who they were beneath the mask? There are accounts, buried in the data slates of the Inquisition, of operatives who never dropped their roles, not even in private, legionaries who lived and died as officers of the Astra Militarum, their deception so complete that they were buried with honors by the very Imperium they sought to undermine. Others lost themselves more subtly, slipping between roles, until there was no stable ground beneath their feet, until their own brethren questioned whether they were still Legion at all. These whispers are not certainties, but the fact that they persist speaks to the truth. The Hydra feeds on identity until identity itself is a tool to be discarded. To face the Alpha Legion is to face yourself in the dark. When an enemy fires, you know him. When an orc charges, when a Tyranid claws, when a Necron rises, you can name the thing before you. But when the Hydra smiles, you see the tilt of your commander's head, the phrasing of your comrade's joke, the small habits that make a person yours, and suddenly you do not know if you have ever truly known them. That is their weapon, not the bolter, not the blade, but the fracture of certainty. There are records of entire companies turning on themselves after the briefest glimpse of a Hydra operative. One wrong smile, one misremembered word, one order given at the wrong time, and soldiers began to suspect, then to accuse, then to fire. The Alpha Legion never needed to strike again. They watched from the shadows, their armor glimmering like oil on the surface of bloodied water, while their enemies unraveled themselves. Yet what of the legionaries themselves? In the brief fragments wrested from captured operatives, though capture is rare in confession, rarer still, the same pattern emerges. They do not speak of loyalty. They do not speak of faith in the dark gods. They speak of the mission, always the mission, and when pressed on what the mission is, their words falter, circle, collapse into silence, as if the mask they wear is not just over their faces, but over their thoughts, as if even they no longer know whether the voice they use is theirs, or the echo of one they once stole. And so, the Hydra smiles. In its reflection, you see yourself, your allies, your leaders, all bent and refracted until no line remains unbroken. To fight them is to fight a shadow of your own making, a phantom that bleeds truth into lie until there is no seam to separate them. And in that smile, perhaps, lies the cruelest victory, not the death of the body, but the slow erosion of the self, until even the legionary behind the mask no longer remembers who he was before the mirror-turned bore is built on the mundane, not the clash of titans or the roar of orbital bombardments, but on the endless machinery of supplies rations delivered on time, Laskin charge packs stacked in neat rows, Prometheum drums hauled to the front before tanks fall silent. The Alpha Legion understands this more keenly than most, and it is here, in the hidden arteries of war, that they strike. They do not need to break the walls of fortresses when they can simply starve the garrisons inside. They do not need to slaughter regiments if those regiments march themselves into wastelands on false coordinates. Their battlefield is the ledger, the data slate, the order whispered through Vox at midnight. And in that battlefield, every coin they spend buys nothing but ruin. The first signs are always subtle. A convoy does not arrive when expected. A shipment of ammunition is found misrouted to an unused depot. Commanders reassure themselves that such mistakes are common in wars stretched across stars, that human error explains the cracks. But soon the cracks widen. Entire platoons wait days for food that never comes. Officers pore over maps, only to discover that the supply routes they've been given lead into valleys already lost to the enemy. The Alpha Legion does not need to fire a shot. They let the Imperium's own weight crush itself. There are testimonies of guardsmen collapsing at their posts, bodies gaunt, uniforms stiff with the salt of unwashed sweat. They held lasguns with shaking hands, unable to fire even when the enemy finally came. Others describe units who marched for days only to find themselves circling the same ruined manufactorum again and again, as if the planet itself had betrayed them. In truth, it was not the ground but the information they trusted. The Hydra does not forge steel. It forges lies, and lies kill more surely than any bolt shell. The economy of war is fragile, and the Alpha Legion knows precisely which strands to cut. A single shipment of promethium redirected into a dead sector leaves whole armored columns frozen in place, their engines sputtering in silence. A shipment of medical supplies delivered to a regiment already annihilated ensures that the wounded in another regiment die screaming on the mud. And still the Hydra remains unseen, hidden behind false seals, falsified signatures, and voices on the Vox that speak with flawless authority. The bureaucracy of the Imperium, immense and suffocating, becomes the Legion's perfect weapon. What better disguise for sabotage than inefficiency itself? The dread grows not from battle, but from the waiting. Soldiers know they are being starved, know they are being bled dry, but cannot name the hand that does it. Each officer suspects the other. Commissars whisper of corruption. Inquisition agents arrive, hunting traitors among the very ranks that have already been hollowed out. The Alpha Legion need only stand aside and watch as paranoia does their work for them. Wars collapse, not in explosions, but in silence. When the lines of supply have rotted away and entire armies dissolve like paper in rain, even chaos warbands are not immune. The Hydra infiltrates them as well, withholding resources at critical moments, ensuring that rival champions stumble and fall while others rise in their place. The same coin buys nothing for the Imperium and nothing for chaos either, save for the Hydra's amusement at watching both sides bleed. Their victories are often invisible, written not in the rubble of cities, but in the quiet note of a failed requisition request, in the empty shelves of an overrun depot, in the hollow eyes of a soldier who has eaten nothing in 3 days. The most terrifying accounts speak of campaigns that ended before they began, entire crusades prepared, fleets mobilized, banners unfurled, and then months later, nothing remained but ships drifting without fuel, soldiers deserting in hunger, and commanders executed for incompetence. Not a single Alpha Legionnaire had been seen, yet their fingerprints lay across every failure. They had spent nothing but lies, and with them purchased entire wars that devoured themselves. To fight the Alpha Legion is to fight absence. There is no enemy line to charge, no fortress to besiege, no champion to strike down. There is only hunger, only delay, only the slow corrosion of trust in the very machinery meant to sustain war. Their coin buys nothing, and in buying nothing, they leave behind nothing but ash. It begins as a whisper, a name carried in secret across the Vox, murmured in barracks, scratched into the corners of data slates. Alpharius, not as history records him, not as the archives of the heresy describe, but as a presence still walking, still commanding, still breathing behind the faces of his sons. The Alpha Legion nurtures this whisper as carefully as a priest tends his flame. They do not need it to be true. They need it only to spread. In sermons delivered by Imperial preachers, the name is invoked as a curse, a warning of treachery. But to speak it is to grant it life, and life is all the Hydra requires. Some claim that Alpharius walks openly in the armor of his legion, his features unchanged by time. Others insist that every legionary is Alpharius, that each face beneath the helm is his face, each voice his voice. Kill one, and the truth is revealed. Alpharius remains untouched, multiplied. The more they fall, the stronger the myth becomes. The Imperium has fought this idea for 10,000 years, yet every denial makes it stronger. When an inquisitor declares Alpharius dead, executed, long ago, the Hydra replies with silence, and silence is worse than contradiction. In that silence, doubt coils. If he is dead, Why do his sons claim his name still? If he was slain, why does no account of his corpse remain? No picked capture, no relic, no body, only words. And words bend more easily than steel. On battlefields, the litany becomes weapon. An Alpha Legionnaire falls, his armor cracked, his blood spilling into the dirt. He raises his head, breathes the words, "I am Alpharius," and dies. Those who hear it repeat it. Some whisper it in fear, others in scorn. But the phrase passes down the line until the soldiers of the Astra Militarum cannot kill without wondering if the act itself proves the Primarch's survival. The moment of hesitation is enough. Less fire stutters, orders waver, and the Hydra's coils tighten unseen. For the legionaries themselves, the paradox runs deeper. To be Alpharius is to surrender individuality entirely. The self dissolves into something greater, something endless. Some historians call it madness, the loss of identity within a shared delusion. Others argue it is genius, a doctrine of survival that transforms every soldier into both leader and pawn at once. Within the Legion, perhaps, the truth is neither. It is simply necessity, in a galaxy where certainty is death. They make uncertainty immortal. There are stories fragmented, half-buried in inquisitorial vaults of commanders who swore they spoke directly to Alpharius himself. They describe him as calm, assured, carrying the quiet weight of a leader who has never truly been absent. Yet others claim the encounters were staged, a trick of the Hydra. One legionary playing the role long enough to instill despair before vanishing again. Which of these is true is irrelevant. The only truth that matters is that both accounts exist, and both erode the mind of anyone who hears them. Faith itself becomes a battlefield. The ecclesiarchy preaches that the Emperor's enemies can be named, fought, defeated, but the Alpha Legion laughs in silence, for they have no single name, no single face. To kill them is to strengthen them, to deny them is to affirm them. The Hydra does not rely on strength of arms, but on the weakness of human thought, on the fragile need for certainty in a galaxy that has none. And so the Imperium finds itself fighting not soldiers, but an echo that grows louder the more it is resisted. That resonates through paranoia until every guardsman glances at his comrade and wonders if he is Alpharius too. The name becomes curse, prayer, weapon, identity. It no longer matters if Alpharius lives. The Imperium cannot kill an idea, and the Alpha Legion has become idea itself. The Alpha Legion does not measure time as others do, where the Astra Militarum counts victories in days of survival, and the Astartes in decades of crusades. The Hydra sees centuries as single moves in a game without board or rule. Every skirmish, every whispered order, every death placed with intent becomes a thread, and when those threads are pulled together, they reveal not a battle won or lost, but a tapestry still unfolding, its pattern too vast for mortal eyes. Imperial agents who study them often begin with confidence. The Inquisition prides itself on tracing heresies to their roots, on uncovering the hands that weave corruption, but against the Alpha Legion, confidence curdles into obsession. Reports contradict each other. Witnesses vanish. Campaigns thought settled reappeared decades later, revealed as nothing more than staging grounds for some deeper design. Agents chasing the Hydra find themselves circling endlessly until they begin to suspect that their very pursuit is part of the plan. The fear runs deeper still. What if resisting them is itself a form of obedience? What if every countermeasure, every campaign, every purge has already been accounted for? Such thoughts are not spoken openly, but they bloom like mold in the dark corners of interrogators' chambers. Some inquisitors burn their own archives, convinced that the Legion seeded them with false trails from the beginning. Others descend into silence, broken by the realization that certainty itself has become a weapon turned against them. The Alpha Legion nurtures this doubt with precision. They fight battles they seem destined to lose, only for the echoes of those defeats to fracture loyalties elsewhere. a garrison saved too easily, begins to suspect the hand that granted them victory. A fleet drawn away to crush what seems a minor Hydra presence returns to find its absence has doomed an entire sector. Even failure tastes of poison, because in the calculus of the Hydra, there is no failure. There is only placement, a piece moved where it was meant to be. A note added to the hidden symphony. Across the galaxy, fragments of their work appear disconnected. A cult rises on a frontier world, preaching in the cadence of an imperial creed, yet subtly altered. Decades later, those same words resurface in the speech of a planetary governor who has never left his throne. A data slate, buried in a collapsed archive, is uncovered centuries after a campaign ends. Carrying orders in a hand, no loyal scribe ever wrote. None of these events link cleanly, yet they ripple with familiarity, as though the Hydra's hand had brushed across them long ago. Some whisper that the Legion serves not chaos at all, but something else, some secret doctrine carried from their Primarch's mouth before the heresy drowned the galaxy in blood. Others insist that the dark gods themselves allow their ambiguity, finding delight in the way their coils confuse even demons. But all who speak of them agree on this. The Alpha Legion endures because their purpose has no end. It does not collapse when a fortress falls. It does not wither when a world burns. It extends beyond defeat, beyond death, beyond the comprehension of those who struggle against it. And so the Imperium fights shadows stretched across generations. Each war becomes suspect. Was the uprising on Deltros a genuine rebellion, or the opening move of a Hydra cell that will not reveal itself for another 1,000 years? Did the suppression of a cult extinguish heresy, or did it plant the seed of obedience that will bloom when the Imperium is weakest? The line between victory and manipulation vanishes, leaving only unease. In this way, the Hydra ensures its immortality, not through strength of arms, nor through the blessings of the warp alone, but through time itself. For even when every Alpha Legionnaire lies dead upon the field, the mission continues. The tapestry does not unravel, it waits, patient, coiled, eternal. Colonel Merrick had built his name on order. In a galaxy devoured by madness, he believed discipline and clarity could carve a path through chaos. His regiment had survived 3 campaigns under his command, their banners darkened by mud and smoke, but never lowered in defeat. He wore his medals not as decoration, but as proof that loyalty, structure, and obedience could preserve a man against the horrors of the galaxy. Yet, by the time he realized what the Alpha Legion had done to him, all those victories lay hollow, their weight turned to ash. It began with the convoys. Marek prided himself on logistics, on moving men and supplies, with precision across hostile terrain. He drilled his officers until they could recite supply routes in their sleep, until fuel and food reached the front with the inevitability of dawn, when the first sabotage struck an ambush in a ravine. A convoy of promethium reduced to fire and screams. He took it as the natural cost of war. They adapted, rerouted, fought harder, and yet each time he adjusted, the enemy was waiting. The reports unsettled him. Raiders striking convoys with uncanny timing, supply depots collapsing into ruin days before they were needed most. The same pattern repeated again and again, until Marek's men grew gaunt, their eyes hollow, their lasguns clutched like relics rather than weapons. Still, the colonel told himself he was winning. Every attack repelled, every line held felt like proof that his skill outweighed the enemy's cunning. But the thought returned, gnawing at him in sleepless hours. Why did the enemy always know? The truth arrived not as revelation, but as slow corrosion. On Kessa Ridge, when the regiment held a line against a superior force, Marek's triumph was celebrated in voxcasts across the sector. Yet months later, he discovered that his victory had simply pinned his regiment in place while neighboring systems collapsed. On Vera Delta, his brilliant defense of a munitions plant was hailed as tactical genius. Only later, did he learn the Alpha Legion had never intended to take the plant at all. Its defense was meaningless. The real prize lost elsewhere while he wasted lives protecting rubble. The realization cracked him. His career had not been a chain of triumphs, but a string of puppeteers' pulls. Every convoy he had saved had been bait, placed precisely where the Alpha Legion wanted him to focus. Every sabotage he believed was enemy failure had been his own obedience, marching exactly where they desired. He had not beaten them. He had performed for them. The bitterness came like acid. He remembered every speech to his men, every promise that their suffering was for victory. Now he saw only the hollow eyes of soldiers who had died on meaningless ground. Their blood spilled not for the Emperor, not even for survival, but for the Hydra's plan. The banners he had preserved through sweat and iron discipline mocked him, their colors nothing more than proof of how thoroughly he had been used. The Alpha Legion had not robbed him of his life, though they could have. They had left him alive to see it, to carry the knowledge like a wound that would never close. He still had his regiment, but when he looked at them, he saw not comrades but ghosts, walking in a play scripted by another hand. His commands tasted of ash on his tongue. His victories echoed as lies in his mind. He had been loyal, disciplined, relentless, and it had served the enemy perfectly. Somewhere, perhaps, a Hydra operative smiled, watching him crumble. Or perhaps they had already moved on, indifferent, his ruin only one thread in a tapestry too vast for him to comprehend. That thought tormented him most. That his destruction was not even the point. That he had not mattered enough to be targeted, only positioned, nudged, shaped into a pawn without knowing it. When his officers saluted him, when his men still obeyed, Marek felt the weight of futility. The war would continue, battles would rage, banners would rise and fall, but the meaning was gone. He no longer knew whether his orders served the Emperor or the Hydra, whether each march forward was resistance or compliance. He stood in the mud of another nameless world, last pistol in hand, and wondered if his entire life had been a war fought for an enemy who never truly existed. The Hydra has no loyalty but to itself, even within the seething ranks of chaos, where oaths are bound in blood and faith is measured in offerings to the warp. The Alpha Legion winds its coils. They whisper, not only into the ears of Imperial commanders, but into those of warlords sworn to the dark gods. They march beside champions of Khorne, plot with sorcerers of Desi and Chneel, in the shadow of Nurgle's swollen prophets, and even move unseen through the decadence of Slaanish's hosts. Yet none can claim the Hydra as their own. To fight with the Alpha Legion is to wonder whether the knife at your back was theirs all along. Traitor warbands speak of them with the same unease the Imperium does. A company of world eaters charges into battle, blood-slicked and roaring, only to realize too late that their flank has been left open. Their fury consumes them, but the Alpha Legion has already departed. Their shimmering armor vanished into the void, leaving allies to bleed for victories that were never theirs to claim. A sorcerer of the Thousand Suns weaves a ritual meant to unmake a city. Yet the words of his incantation echo with inflections not his own. He wonders, too late, if the syllables he chants are his will or the Hydra's design. Even demons, birthed from the nightmares of mortals and bound by the will of the dark gods, are not immune. There are tales of summoned hosts who arrive only to find themselves serving a campaign that unravels into silence. Their fury wasted while the Alpha Legion slips away with the true prize. The warp itself may bend to the dark gods, but information, deception, and doubt belong to the Hydra. What makes this most terrifying is not betrayal, it is the absence of betrayal. To betray requires loyalty first, and the Alpha Legion gives none. They embed within chaos, as they do within the Imperium, seamlessly, invisibly, their intentions unreadable. A champion of Nurgle may rise high on victories, never realizing that each triumph was engineered by Alpha Legion operatives planting false orders, seeding misinformation, guiding his steps until the warlord believes himself favored by his god. Only when he has abandoned resources gone, armies shattered, does he glimpse the truth. His victories never belonged to him. They never belonged to they belonged to the Hydra. Among the Traitor Legions, paranoia runs deep. Night Lords whisper that the Alpha Legion fights beside them only to catalog their weaknesses. Iron Warriors suspect every collapsed siege line might be Hydra sabotage. Even the word-bearers, so drunk on their own devotion, watch for the shimmer of oil-colored armor in their midst, knowing that zealotry itself can be redirected with the right nudge. And the most damning truth is this: the Alpha Legion does not need to control entire campaigns. A single suggestion at the right moment, a single lie slipped into the right ear, can turn a crusade's course. Some whisper that the Alpha Legion still holds to the Primarch's hidden doctrine, some buried mission so profound that not even the dark gods can command it. Others claim they are the truest of Chaos's servants, embodying Tzeentch's endless deception in every breath. But even demons cannot say for certain. The Hydra thrives in that uncertainty, their power magnified by the fact that even their allies cannot distinguish ally from infiltrator, aid from manipulation. The question that haunts both loyalist and traitor alike is simple. If even the dark gods cannot be certain whether a victory was theirs or the Hydra's, then whose galaxy is this war truly shaping? The Imperium bleeds, chaos rages, demons scream in eternity, but the Hydra smiles. Unseen, eternal coils tightening around both sides alike. The Alpha Legion does not need to conquer. They do not raise flags over cities, nor leave monuments to mark their victories. Their war is borderless, a contagion that spreads across subsectors, unraveling order until the galaxy itself forgets who struck the first blow. They fight not for territory but for collapse, for the moment when systems eat themselves alive and the Hydra's hand is never seen upon the knife. It often begins with something small, a workers' riot in a hive, a Vox broadcast declaring shortages that do not exist, a rumor that the governor has already fled off-world. Panic blooms faster than any virus, and in the claustrophobic pressure of an imperial world, fear is enough to shatter unity. Within weeks, hablocks burn, administratum records vanish in flames, and soldiers are too busy turning their weapons inward to notice the enemy beyond the walls. The Hydra never needs to reveal itself. The war begins and ends without their open presence. Relief fleets are the next to fall. Guided by falsified astropathic signals, they are pulled into systems already stripped bare. Fuel dwindles, augurs report phantom enemy formations, and by the time commanders realize they have been misled, entire sectors have burned in their absence. Worse still, are the fleets that do arrive, lead to discover that the population they were meant to save has already revolted, convinced that the Imperium abandoned them. In that moment, loyal soldiers become occupiers, and the Hydra's coils tighten, unseen but inevitable. At the galactic scale, the Alpha Legion's touch is felt as silence. A world once bustling with manufactorums suddenly transmits nothing but static. A shrine world known for its pilgrimages becomes a graveyard of ash without any record of an invasion. Planets vanish not into the warp, but into absence emptied by wars whose authors are unknown, whose victories belong to no one. By the time the Imperium realizes what has occurred, there is nothing left to reclaim. The most terrifying aspect is that there is no front line to trace. Orcs leave trails of ruin, Tyranids devour ecosystems, Necrons march in cold precision. But the Alpha Legion leaves only questions. Administrators wonder if an uprising was natural unrest or Hydra design. Inquisitors cannot decide whether a lost fleet was sabotaged or merely incompetent. Every loss feels self-inflicted, every defeat indistinguishable from the Imperium's own failings. The Hydra thrives in that blindness, because no victory against them can ever be declared when no one knows they were there, and so the galaxy collapses in fragments. A governor's refusal to believe in phantom enemies leads him to execute loyal regiments. A fleet commander wastes precious months suppressing a rebellion staged by Hydra operatives, only to discover that the true war was fought 3 systems away. Faith fractures as shrines are left undefended. Suspicion rots the bonds between soldiers, and entire oaths sworn to Terra become meaningless in the silence left behind. The Alpha Legion does not rule the ashes, they leave. They do not linger to garrison, to govern, to proclaim. They vanish as easily as they arrived, slipping back into the folds of uncertainty. Their victories are not measured in ground taken, but in oaths forgotten, in banners burned by those who once bore them, in cities emptied not by fire, but by despair. To the Imperium, the Hydra is not just an enemy. It is the realization that collapse itself may need no conqueror, only a whisper at the right time, and the patience to let the galaxy devour itself. Names are anchors. In the Imperium, they are proof that a man has lived, fought, and died in service to the Emperor. Entire cities are named for martyrs. Regiments bear the titles of their heroes. Even the smallest guardsman may hope his name will be carved into a cenotaph when his duty ends. But against the Alpha Legion, names do not survive. Their greatest weapon is not the bolter or blade, but erasure. Where their presence should be carved into record, there is only absence. Where their victories should be tallied, there is only silence. For the Inquisition, this is the deepest wound. Their archives span millennia. Their scribes record the smallest fluctuation of cult activity. Their interrogators catalog heresies with obsessive detail. Yet when it comes to the Alpha Legion, even their most sacred vaults are blank. Campaigns unravel with no evidence of who commanded them. Witness testimonies collapse into contradiction. Data slates flicker with corrupted entries, leaving only empty fields where identities should lie. And the worst realization is that this is not accident, it is design. The Hydra does not simply kill its enemies. It unravels their memory, stealing the very proof of conflict. Veterans speak of battles that do not exist. A guardsman recalls fighting alongside a tall figure in cobalt armor who called himself Alpharius. His comrades swear no such warrior was present. A commissar remembers an ambush where orders saved his life, but the records show he was never deployed there. Across the Imperium, fragments like these litter the histories of countless campaigns, ghost stories that refuse to die. Even as official record denies them, the Alpha Legion thrives in that void, because to be doubted is to be eternal. Even in defeat, they deny the Imperium the satisfaction of victory. When a Hydra cell is cornered, its warriors slain, its leaders exposed, the aftermath unravels itself. Bodies vanish, identities collapse. No one can say with certainty who was killed, or if anyone was killed at all. Sometimes the battlefield is found empty, as if the combatants had never existed. Other times the dead wear insignia that crumbles to dust at a touch, as though reality itself refuses to acknowledge them. The Imperium cannot celebrate triumph when there is nothing to prove it. This anonymity becomes contagion. Soldiers whisper that perhaps the Alpha Legion cannot be killed at all, that each time a warrior falls, his name dissolves so that another may rise in his place, unburdened by record or memory. In some regiments, guardsmen refuse to even speak the Legion's name, fearing that to acknowledge them grants permanence to the phantom. Silence spreads, and with silence, the Hydra grows stronger. For what cannot be named cannot be destroyed. The psychological toll is devastating. An officer cannot rally his men by declaring victory over an enemy whose existence the archives deny. A preacher cannot inspire faith by recounting martyrs whose deaths are scrubbed from memory. Even inquisitors, sworn to uncover heresy in all forms, admit in hushed tones that the Alpha Legion robs them of their purpose. What use is truth when it vanishes the moment it is written? What meaning has vigilance when every discovery fades into blanks? There are whispers, too, of darker implications. Some claim the Hydra does not simply erase itself, but consumes the memory of those who oppose it. Veterans forget details they once swore were carved into their souls. Administrators misplace entire records. They remember transcribing only hours earlier. It is said that even the warp itself recoils from the Alpha Legion's name, refusing to carry it on currents of madness as it does the names of other Traitor Legions. Whether this is sorcery, technology, or merely rumor, no one can say, but the effect is the same. To fight the Alpha Legion is to stand on shifting ground, to find victory dissolve in your hands until even triumph feels like failure in the end. The Hydra's greatest triumph is this: to deny their enemies the certainty of remembrance. Wars are fought, soldiers bleed, cities burn, but when the dust settles, the record is silent. The Alpha Legion was never there. No medals are awarded, no songs are sung, no histories are written. Only the hollow memory remains, an ache without a name. The Alpha Legion has always been more than an enemy. They are a question, and a question is harder to kill than any man. Every tale of their interference ends in silence, in contradiction, in uncertainty that eats at the marrow of the Imperium's confidence. Unlike the other Traitor Legions, they do not fight for bloodlust, devotion, or excess. They fight for something unseen, something that cannot be catalogued even in the most guarded archives of the Inquisition. The others are monsters. The Hydra is doubt itself, and when doubt takes root, it outlives the war. It outlives the commander. It outlives the memory of who began the fight at all. Those who have faced them describe a kind of suffocation, not of air, but of certainty. Orders arrive, but no one can confirm their source. Victories collapse into defeats when examined too closely. Enemies killed rise again under new names, claiming the same identity, until a commander does not know if he has killed the same man 5 times, or none at all. This is the Hydra's gift: to erase cause and effect, to blur beginnings and endings until nothing can be trusted, and within that void of trust, their true purpose hides. Coiled and patient, the archives of the heresy give us fragments, but fragments are poison when wielded by the Alpha Legion. Alpharius and Omegon twins, reflections. Contradictions alone were told of a future in which the Emperor's victory doomed mankind to unending war. If the Cabal spoke truth, then perhaps the Legion's treachery was not treachery at all, but sacrifice. If the Cabal lied, then perhaps the Hydra has been enslaved to deception greater than any they have themselves sown. The galaxy cannot decide, and that uncertainty is their weapon as much as their bolters. Consider the strange patience of their actions. Where others seek conquests, the Alpha Legion abandons ground freely. Where others burn worlds, they leave them standing hollow, mistrustful, gnawed from within. Their battles never resolve, their wars never end, because endings are not their aim. They weave tension, they extend conflicts. They stretch questions across centuries until the Imperium wastes itself trying to answer. What is the Alpha Legion fighting for? The very act of asking burns resources, exhausts minds, drains faith. And so, the Hydra wins not by striking, but by making the Imperium strike itself. Some whisper that their mission is loyalty in its most paradoxical form, that they destroy Imperial campaigns so that humanity itself may be preserved from a darker fate, unseen and unimaginable, that they still serve the Emperor, not in worship, but in sacrifice, playing the role of villains so that mankind's destiny might bend toward survival. If this is true, then the Alpha Legion are martyrs without graves, loyalists cursed to be remembered as traitors forever. But even this idea may be their own deception, seeded deliberately so that their enemies waste decades debating what cannot be known. Others insist the Hydra is chaos incarnate, the truest expression of disin, where the thousand suns wield sorcery. The Alpha Legion wields doubt, and doubt is sorcery of the mind. Each deception is a spell, each erased record a hex, each false victory a curse, laid upon those who believed it. The dark gods require belief, and what better service to them than to erode belief itself, until mortals cannot tell loyalty from heresy. If this is their path, then even the demons of the warp must bow. For the Hydra wages war, not only on flesh and steel, but on meaning itself. And yet, there are darker possibilities still. The notion that the Alpha Legion does not serve chaos at all, nor the Emperor, nor even the memory of their primarchs. That their work is a foundation for something not yet visible, a preparation for a design no one has seen. Perhaps their purpose lies dormant, gestating through centuries of manipulation. Every uprising seeded, every supply line sabotaged, every name erased may be nothing but groundwork for a plan that will not reveal itself until the galaxy is already too far gone to resist. In this vision, the long war itself is misdirection, a curtain concealing the true performance waiting behind. What terrifies Imperial agents most is not the possibility of losing to the Hydra in open battle, but the realization that every battle might already be irrelevant, that the wars they fight against the Alpha Legion are diversions meant to occupy their attention, while the real mission unfolds elsewhere, unseen. The Inquisition whispers of entire crusades wasted, not because they were defeated, but because victory itself was the Hydra's design. And what can loyalty mean in such a world, when to obey might be to betray, and to betray might be to serve? The galaxy is littered with campaigns where the Alpha Legion's touch is suspected, but never proven. Planets that fall without invasion. Wars that consume themselves without an enemy commander ever revealed. Fleets that arrive too late. Rebellions that vanish without trace. Leaders who speak words not their own before dying. In each case, records contradict, testimonies dissolve, and the Hydra's name is never written. Yet those who lived through them know. They feel the coils, even if they cannot see them. They whisper in fear that the Alpha Legion was there. Even when the archives say nothing at all, the dread does not come from what they have done, but from what they have not yet done. 10,000 years of shadow war, of whispers, of sabotage and infiltration, all of it may be prelude. Perhaps the Hydra has not even begun. Perhaps their true purpose waits still, a weapon coiled in silence, patient beyond comprehension. If so, then everything endured the heresy, the long war, the endless bloodshed of a galaxy devouring itself, has been nothing more than rehearsal. And so, the Imperium fights on, blind and weary, never sure if its victories are real, never sure if its enemies are truly defeated, never sure if the Hydra's hand is guiding them even as they strike. The Alpha Legion leaves, no monuments, no songs, no names, only the dread that their purpose lies ahead, unspoken, unguessed, still waiting. The betrayal began with a pause, a moment so slight that most of the regiment never noticed, a fracture in the chain of command, no longer than a heartbeat. The vox crackled, the order stuttered, and in that falter lay the ruin of thousands. Soldiers are trained to obey without hesitation, and hesitation spreads faster than flame. By the time the voice resumed, steady and confident once more, doubt had already taken root. Colonel Yarrick was the first to feel it. His command staff sat around the field table, its surface alive with shifting hololithic displays of enemy movements. The order had been simple: redeploy the artillery to the southern ridge, cut off the anticipated armored thrust. Logical sound, yet the pause before the words had set Yarrick's teeth on edge. He looked at the faces of his aides, searching for the same unease. They were pale, silent, their eyes fixed on the map, but not on the truth unraveling in front of them. One voice in the Vox chain had faltered, and that falter was enough to hollow out the ground beneath them. The Alpha Legion thrived on such fractures. They knew a soldier could weather bombardment, starvation, even the slow grind of attrition. But the whisper of betrayal, that was a wound no armor could shield against. Yarrick's staff began to argue, softly at first, then sharper, until the command chamber rang louder with suspicion than with the roar of battle outside. Was the order genuine? Was the southern ridge even the true target? Was the commander, whose voice had spoken the order, compromised or worse, already replaced? In the trenches, the poison spread. Artillery units delayed their movement, unwilling to obey until certainty returned. Infantry companies froze in their dugouts, waiting for confirmation that never came. When the enemy advanced, they found their foes not shattered by fire, but paralyzed by fear. The Hydra had never needed to fire a single round. Its weapon had been the doubt carried on a broken syllable, a pause in the voice of authority that stripped away cohesion faster than any barrage. Yarok tried to rally his men, storming from position to position, bellowing that he still commanded. Yet each time he spoke, he saw the flicker in their eyes. Was he still himself? Had the Hydra's coils wrapped around him, hollowing him from within? His own staff whispered when they thought he could not hear. Commissars watched him more closely than they did the enemy lines. His orders, once obeyed instantly, now moved like sludge through the regiment. Delayed, debated, sometimes ignored entirely. The battlefield itself warped under this contagion of suspicion. Squads fired upon their own reinforcements, convinced the newcomers were Hydra infiltrators wearing stolen armor. Officers shot their aides, swearing their eyes glowed with unnatural light. Whole companies dug in against phantom enemies, convinced that to move was to walk into ambush. The Alpha Legion had infected them not with blades or shells, but with a single question: who can you trust? By nightfall, the regiment was fighting itself more fiercely than it fought the true enemy. The southern ridge lay empty, the artillery abandoned, the infantry fractured into pockets of paranoia. Yarok stood at the center of it, his voice hoarse, his certainty collapsing. He realized then that the betrayal was not external. It did not matter whether the compromised voice had been Hydra or merely error. The damage was done. The Hydra's weapon was not possession or replacement, but the suggestion of them. A single pause had been enough to convince thousands that betrayal had already occurred. The Alpha Legion never revealed itself that night. No shimmering armor appeared at the edge of the trenches. No bolters flared in the dark. They did not need to. The regiment destroyed itself, suspicion sharpening into mutiny, discipline curdling into chaos. By dawn, Yarok's command was gone, not defeated by superior force, but devoured from within. The southern ridge had never mattered. The true battlefield had been the Vox chain, the faltering voice that turned men against themselves. And when the Inquisition came to catalog the disaster, they found no evidence of Alpha Legion presence at all. Only soldiers who had murdered their comrades. Only commanders stripped of authority by their own men. Only silenced where once there had been loyalty. The Hydra's betrayal was not loud. It was not marked by blood-soaked banners or shattered fortresses. It was a silence, a pause, a question that unmade an army, without the enemy ever needing to step onto the field. The mask that smiled back was never a simple disguise. It was not ceramite, painted in shifting hues, nor a skin-thin falsehood that could be torn away, with hands trembling in rage. The mask was trust itself, shaped over years of shared breath, shared hunger, shared firelight in the ruins of dying worlds. The Alpha Legion did not need to construct artifice when human memory would do it for them. A soldier wants to believe that the man beside him is true. A loyalist cell, fighting in the shadows against heretics and traitors, craves stability even more than food or water. And so the Hydra offers them that stability, feeding it back to them in their own reflections, until the mask is indistinguishable from the face they most wish to see. Deyranif. That was ever his name, entered their lives with nothing extraordinary. A trooper displaced from another regiment. A survivor of a shattered company. A man with no past, but a future, ready to serve. He bore the marks of hardship they all knew too well. The worn boots, the scar across the jawline, the eyes clouded by sleeplessness. Nothing about him spoke of lies. Nothing about him whispered of Hydra coils beneath the flesh. That was the brilliance of it. He was ordinary, painfully so, and in that ordinariness the cell found comfort. Trust hardened into faith with every act. Darren carried the wounded when no one else had the strength. He scavenged ammo, caches hidden in places no one thought to search. He remembered prayers by heart, speaking them in the old high Gothic intonations that many in the cell had forgotten. He did not lead, not at first. He stood just behind, steadying the line, offering encouragement in battle, lending his shoulder when the commissar faltered. By the time they looked back, he was no longer one of them. He was the one they looked toward. The Hydra's brilliance lies not in the act of deception, but in how it becomes indistinguishable from the truth. When Darren raised his lasgun, they did not wonder why his aim never missed. When he gave orders, they did not question why he seemed to anticipate the enemy's movements before augurs reported them. They did not suspect, because suspicion is a luxury, and men clinging to survival cannot afford luxuries. They believed, because belief kept them alive. But reflections cannot hold forever. Small fractures crept in. A face seen in the gleam of promethium light that was not his. A word spoken in a dialect he should not know. A gesture repeated too precisely, as though rehearsed. These moments were dismissed, buried beneath gratitude and necessity, until the manufactorum raid, when everything collapsed. The raid had been brutal. The cell fought through corridors choked with oil fumes and shattered glass against heretics who once wore the same uniforms. They bled and screamed, their bodies pressed into corners where firelight turned smoke into walls. Darren guided them through with uncanny precision, warning of ambushes moments before they happened, leading them down paths that should have been unknown. At first, it felt miraculous, but when the cult leader fell too cleanly, his chest split by a shot too perfect, silence descended. Not the silence of victory, but the silence of dread. They saw him then not as comrade, not as savior, but as something else. His smile was calm, practiced, patient, a smile that said the performance had ended. They ripped away his helm, desperate to see what hid beneath, and in that moment, the Hydra revealed its cruelest weapon. Each soldier saw a different face, a lost brother, a dead commander, a childhood friend buried in memory. Darren had never been one man. He had been all of them, each reflection tailored, each detail exact, each truth borrowed from their own hearts. Panic is easy to stoke in the midst of battle, but this was not panic. It was despair. The realization that they had never truly known him, and worse that they had shaped him themselves. They had given him their memories, their grief, their longing, and he had reflected it back until they could not tell the difference. The mask was not his invention. It was theirs. Weapons trembled but did not fire. To strike him down would be to kill the faces of the dead they still loved. To spare him was to admit that their trust had been nothing but a noose placed willingly around their own throats. They froze, trapped in the Hydra's most perfect snare, choice without meaning, truth without certainty. What happened after remains uncertain. Some reports claim they executed him, but no records confirm it. Others suggest he walked free, leaving them broken in silence. What is certain is that the cell dissolved. Survivors abandoned their posts, scattered into obscurity, unwilling to face comrades who might now wear Hydra smiles. Those who remained were haunted, unable to look into a mirror without seeing Darren's face instead of their own. The Inquisition found fragments of testimony years later. Soldiers who spoke of hearing his voice long after his absence, of seeing his figure in dreams, of doubting every ally who stood at their side. One swore that he saw Darren reflected in the water of his canteen, smiling as though the mask had never been removed. Another cut out his own eyes, declaring that vision itself could no longer be trusted. These were not confessions of men who had been deceived once. They were confessions of men who could never again believe in the very concept of truth. This is the Hydra's greatest cruelty. Bolter fire kills the body, blades sever flesh, the warp devours souls, but the Alpha Legion robs meaning by showing that trust can be molded, that faces can be rewritten. They leave survivors incapable of faith in anything, not their leaders, not their comrades, not even themselves. A man without trust is already dead, even if his heart still beats. And so the mask that smiled back was not Darren's alone. It belonged to them all. Every survivor who saw him wore the mask afterward, doubting their reflection, doubting the line between self and other. The Alpha Legion had not infiltrated a cell. They had infiltrated memory itself, and memory is a battlefield no army can ever reclaim. The banners that once flew proudly from the masts of void ships now sagged in silence, their cloths stiff with the dust of decades spent chasing phantoms. Veterans sat in the shadowed holds of troop carriers, staring at their lasguns as though the weapons themselves mocked them, forged for battles that had never been. Commissars, who once roared sermons at parade grounds, now whispered their prayers into empty air, unsure whether the God Emperor had heard them, or whether even faith itself had been led into a labyrinth with no exit. A war had been fought, at least in their hearts and their bodies, but not in truth. The Alpha Legion had stolen the very substance of conflict, leaving only the hollow shell of ritual without substance. The first to collapse were the junior officers. They had risen through the ranks during the crusade, earning laurels, commendations, and the obedience of men for victories that turned out to be mirages. One lieutenant, famed for holding a manufactorum for 3 weeks against waves of heretics, slit his own throat when he learned that the manufactorum had been abandoned centuries before. Another confessed that he could no longer remember the names of the men he had saved, because perhaps those men had never existed at all. Their honors, their pride, their very purpose had been built on sand. When the tide of truth swept in, nothing remained. Whole regiments began to mutiny, not from hatred of their commanders, but from despair. On the dust hive of Laresis Prime, soldiers set their own banners aflame, watching in silence as the cloth crumbled into black flakes, refusing to march further for a cause that was now known to be void. On the orbitals above Indros, an entire battle group disabled their own engines and drifted into the void, their captains insisting they would rather vanish into darkness than obey orders written by hands they could no longer trust. And across the subsector, astropaths screamed themselves blind, their minds scarred by the false transmissions that had led them. For so many years, administratum clerks tried to explain away the void in records. They produced charts, manifests, inventories, strings of numbers and figures to prove that the war had been real. They spoke of worlds pacified, heretics purged, tithed resources reclaimed. But the soldiers who had walked those worlds knew the truth. They remembered the stillness of abandoned hives, the silence of manufactorums with dust choking their engines, the absence of an enemy that had supposedly consumed whole star systems. The paperwork was immaculate. The experience was nothing. That contradiction ate at the soul, a wound no balm of bureaucracy could mend. The Inquisition moved swiftly, as it always did when truth threatened the stability of the Imperium. Witnesses were silenced, commanders executed for incompetence, survivors dispersed into other regiments where their stories would dissolve into rumor. Official histories declared the Crusade a triumph, a shining example of Imperial might. Worlds that had never seen an enemy were listed as reclaimed, their emptiness attributed to swift and decisive Imperial action. The lie was sealed in ink and blood, yet every survivor knew the truth, and truth, once seen, cannot be undone. For the Alpha Legion, this was perfection. They had not needed to bleed themselves dry in open war, nor risk the exposure of their operatives in prolonged infiltration. All they had done was bend the channels of information. Astropathic signals altered, augurs filled with false readings, vox commands forged with voices indistinguishable from Imperial authority. A handful of lies had summoned fleets, devoured resources, and consumed decades. No bolters fired, no fortresses stormed, yet the Hydra had triumphed more completely than any conquering army. The Imperium had defeated itself. Guided by the strings, the Alpha Legion pulled from the shadows. What makes such a victory unbearable is its permanence. Resources can be replenished, fleets rebuilt, soldiers recruited, but the time is gone forever. Generations raised for a phantom war have lived and died in futility. Children grew old, waiting for fathers who never returned from a battlefield that never was. Entire planets bled themselves dry to supply armies that fought shadows. Those decades cannot be reclaimed. They are stolen years, buried in the Hydra's coil, never to return. The survivors became hollow vessels, men and women who had learned that their loyalty could be twisted against them. Some returned to their homeworlds only to find themselves strangers, unable to explain where their lives had gone. Others turned to silence, living out their days in mute obedience, unwilling to speak lest every word prove false. And some broken beyond repair sought the Hydra itself, not to kill, but to serve. For if meaning had been stolen from them, perhaps only the thief could give it back. Whispers spread through the ordos of the Inquisition that this had not been the first phantom war, that there were other crusades, other sieges, other campaigns inscribed into the Imperial archives that may never have occurred. But to question too far was to risk collapse. And so the galaxy turned, its administratum, quills writing new lies over the old, its preachers thundering sermons to wash away doubt. Yet, in the dark, in the unlit corners, where soldiers drank themselves numb, the question remained, how many of our wars are real? The Alpha Legion had proven that victory does not require armies, that defeat does not require battle. They had stolen the very concept of truth, teaching the Imperium that even the act of fighting could be hollow. And in that void lies the deepest horror, that perhaps all wars are illusions, and only the Hydra knows which ones matter. The war that wasn't fought left no saints, no martyrs, no legends, only silence, only the echo of wasted decades. And in that echo, if one listens closely, the Hydra's smile can almost be heard. The vaults beneath Ordo's commanderies are said to be in stone layered upon stone, adamantium bulkheads sealed with purity wards, vox dampeners woven into the very foundations so that no whisper escapes. There, inquisitors claim, truth is stored, truth of heresy, truth of rebellion, truth of the galaxy's endless war. Yet truth is not a relic one can lock away. It is fragile, fluid, dependent on ink, on vox, on memory. And so even here, in the fortress built to preserve certainty, the Alpha Legion's hand reaches unseen. It does not begin with revelation, but with something small. A single line in a data slate altered, a regiment number changed, a commander's name transposed. A minor scribe makes a correction, thinking himself dutiful, unaware he has just reinforced the Hydra's design. Then more, a prayer hymn discovered with a phrase inverted. The Emperor protects twisted subtly into the Emperor is protection. A difference so slight it might be a slip of the quill. Yet, when that hymn is copied and recopied across a sector, sung in cathedrals by millions, the meaning changes. Doubt seeps in. And doubt is the Hydra's dominion. Archivists tell of texts that resist their own keepers. Open a vault, and you may find a document that contradicts itself each time it is read. Some swear the ink moves, curling into new forms when the page is turned, letters rearranging themselves as though the parchment lived. Others describe machine code mutating across data crypts, the binary prayers of the Mechanicus unraveling into strings of nonsense that somehow still issue coherent orders. Who placed these intrusions? No one can say. No breach alarms ever sound. No guards see intruders pass. Yet the archives warp nonetheless, reshaped by hands that leave no trace. The Inquisition's response is always violent. Scribes are flayed alive for negligence, their screams echoing through marble halls. Librarians are burned as heretics, accused of contaminating texts they swore to protect. Vaults are sealed, their contents destroyed with fire and acid. But each execution, each purge, achieves nothing, because the Hydra's brilliance is not in creating lies, but in making the truth unknowable. Once contradiction takes root, suspicion consumes everything. Every archivist wonders if his memories are his own. Every inquisitor questions whether the records in her hands are authentic or the Hydra's reflection. Faith suffers most. The Imperium relies on the stability of words, the lectitio divinitatis, the litanies of hate, the creeds that sustain soldiers in the trench. If those words fracture, then faith itself becomes brittle. Imagine a guardsman reaching for the prayer etched into his lasgun's stock, only to find the words shifted, their cadence strange, their meaning hollow. Imagine a priest reciting from a hymn book, only to hear his congregation falter, because the words they memorize no longer match the text. Such moments seem trivial, but faith lives on rhythm and familiarity. Break the rhythm, and belief begins to stutter. Even the Mechanicus, proud in its logic, is not immune. Forge records contradict themselves. A weapon's blueprint appears centuries before the Magos who designed it was born. Skittery cohorts receive orders from Magi listed long dead, their identifiers verified yet impossible. Machine spirits groan in dissonance, their binary hymns collapsing into error. To the Mechanicus, such anomalies are heresy incarnate, yet no purge of code resolves them. No exorcism of logic engines restores balance. The Hydra leaves only paradox, and paradox corrodes devotion more thoroughly than any plague. The Ordos Maleficarum once recorded a case in which an entire vault of heretical manuscripts simply rewrote itself. One day, the texts called for the worship of demons. The next, the same words had become proclamations of loyalty to the emperor, the handwriting unchanged, which was true, which was false. In the end, both versions were burned, the vault sealed forever, but the memory lingered. The inquisitors themselves began to doubt their judgments, wondering if every verdict they had passed was founded on corrupted knowledge. Such doubt spreads like oil across water, staining all it touches. The Alpha Legion knows that memory is war's first casualty. If soldiers cannot trust the past, how can they trust the present? If inquisitors cannot trust their archives, how can they trust their own convictions? The Hydra does not need to rewrite all knowledge. It only needs to rewrite enough that certainty becomes impossible. Once that line is crossed, even untouched records are suspect. Even uncorrupted archives ring false. Truth becomes an enemy. And the Imperium, founded on the absolute certainty of its righteousness, begins to crumble from within. There are whispers of deeper violations. Some claim the Hydra implants false memories directly into witnesses, so that even testimony is unreliable. Others insist the Legion seeds entire campaigns into history that never occurred, fabricating wars with such precision that generations swear they fought in battles that never existed. Whether these rumors are real, or simply the natural consequence of paranoia, does not matter. The Hydra wins either way. For what victory is greater than making the galaxy doubt itself? In the end, the library that lied is not a single place. It is every archive, every data slate, every memory carved into parchment or flesh. The Alpha Legion has shown that knowledge itself is a battlefield, and one they can corrupt without ever being seen. The Inquisition claims dominion over truth. But what happens when truth itself wears the Hydra's smile? What happens when the fortress of memory is revealed to be nothing more than shifting shadows on stone? The Imperium cannot answer, and so its agents turn inward, silencing each other, burning their own records, erasing their own certainty in desperate attempts to cleanse what cannot be cleansed. Each act of erasure is another coil of the Hydra tightening. Each destroyed archive is another victory handed to an enemy who never even raised his bolter. The greatest betrayal is not that the Alpha Legion lies. It is that they make the galaxy realize there may never have been a truth to begin with. He was there from the beginning. That was what made the betrayal unbearable. In every campaign, in every march through dust and ruin, in every hollow victory that cost more than it earned, he was beside them. To the men of the 87th Varan, Trooper Callus was as familiar as the taste of recycled water or the weight of a lasgun across the shoulders. He laughed at the same crude jokes, cursed the same officers, whispered the same half-remembered prayers. He shared rations in the freezing dark, steadied his comrades when shell shock froze them, bled with them when shrapnel tore the air. Nothing about him was extraordinary. That was the brilliance of it. Callus was trust incarnate, the kind of comrade every soldier relies on, the one who listens without judgment, who carries the extra weight when another falters, who speaks just enough to reassure, but never so much as to seem false. He was dependable in the ways that mattered most to soldiers. He did not break in firefights, he did not hoard rations, he did not shirk duties when others slept. They never doubted him, not once. Because doubt cannot live where familiarity has already sunk its roots. The betrayal came not with gunfire, not with ambush, but with silence. At the climax of the Orith campaign, when the regiment was cornered in the habspears of a crumbling city, Callus was the one who guided them through the ruins. He knew where the walls were weakest, where shadows could conceal, where the enemy would not expect them. They trusted him, as they always had. And when they emerged into an open plaza, exposed to fire from every side, they realized too late what had happened. The trap was perfect. Enemy forces closed in from alleys and rooftops, their weapons already trained, their positions chosen long before. Soldiers screamed in confusion, Lasfir streaked into the night, and commissars bellowed for order. But through it all, Callus stood calm. His lasgun hung slack in his hands, his face no longer strained with exhaustion but softened, almost serene. When his comrades turned to him, demanding answers, he simply smiled. It was then they saw it, the faint shimmer along his armor's edge, the oil-slick gleam of paint that was never standard issue. The Hydra had always been there, breathing beside them, waiting for the moment when trust would be worth more than 100 bolter rounds. Some accounts claim he spoke before the slaughter began. Then he told them he was Alpharius, and that their trust had been the weapon all along. Others say he said nothing, that his silence was louder than any confession. What matters is that, in that moment, the regiment broke, not because the enemy's firepower was overwhelming, but because their faith in one another collapsed. If Callus could be Hydra, then anyone could. If trust could be false, then nothing was left to bind them together. The aftermath was worse than the ambush itself. Survivors stumbled through the rubble, unable to meet one another's eyes. Every gesture, every word was suspect. Officers who had commanded for decades found their orders questioned. Commissars saw their authority evaporate. A regiment that had endured starvation, bombardment, and endless attrition dissolved because one man revealed himself not to be a comrade but a reflection of what they needed him to be. What makes this tactic so cruel is its intimacy. Bolters kill at range. Artillery annihilates from afar, but the Hydra kills by proximity, by becoming the person you confide in, the one you lean against when the weight is too much. They invest years into the deception, living entire lives as comrades in arms, sharing not just danger, but the slow rhythm of survival. When the mask is finally removed, the betrayal is not only tactical, it is personal. Soldiers do not just lose a battle, they lose themselves. Veterans of such encounters rarely recover. Some are executed for insubordination when they refuse to obey orders from anyone, fearing every commander is Hydra in disguise. Others take vows of silence, convinced that words can no longer be trusted. The most broken simply walk away in the middle of campaigns, laying down their lasguns and wandering into the wastelands. Unable to bear the weight of comradeship, turned to poison. The Imperium cannot defend against this weapon. It can arm soldiers with armor and weapons. It can drill them in discipline. It can saturate them with faith, but it cannot guard the human heart against trust. Trust is what keeps a guardsman from breaking in the trench. What keeps him marching into fire? What keeps him standing when his body screams to fall? To weaponize trust is to sever the one bond the Imperium cannot afford to lose. The Hydra understands this perfectly. They know that armies collapse not when their guns fall silent, but when their soldiers no longer believe in the man beside them. A single infiltrator, placed well, can undo decades of loyalty, and the wound does not close. It festers, spreading suspicion long after the operative is gone, hollowing out the core of every regiment touched by their deception. The friend you never had is not just a man, he is a lesson, a reminder that in the Hydra's war, there are no comrades, no certainties, no bonds that cannot be broken, only masks, only reflections, only the slow corrosion of faith. And once you have seen that mask smile, you can never again be sure whose face you are looking at. There are moments in Imperial history that shine like beacons against the endless dark. Moments when armies doomed to slaughter survive, when cities thought lost remain standing, when fleets that should have been torn apart in the void emerge whole. They are cherished in song and prayer, invoked by priests and officers alike as proof that the Emperor watches, that he shields his servants from despair. But among these victories are those that curdle under scrutiny, moments that seem too precise, too fortunate, too perfect. These are the Hydra's gifts, mercies that are never mercies. Victories given not to strengthen, but to hollow, to set the stage for collapse. The Alpha Legion understands that war is not fought in days or years, but in centuries. They know the Imperium hungers for victories to justify its endless sacrifice, and so they provide them, sometimes with subtle intervention, an enemy leader found dead, assassinated by hands unknown, sometimes with open generosity supply, caches left in ruined habs, perfectly stocked with what starving soldiers most desperately need, sometimes with illusions so deep that even inquisitors are deceived, whole armies routed, their banners captured and displayed, though no one ever saw the battle itself. These are gifts the Imperium accepts without question, because to question is treason, and to refuse salvation is madness. For those who live through such moments, the relief is overwhelming. A guardsman, half-starved, breaks into tears when he finds rations waiting in the rubble. A commander on the brink of defeat kneels in gratitude when his enemies inexplicably withdraw. A preacher raises his voice to the heavens when a shrine's city, surrounded on all sides, finds itself suddenly free. They believe themselves blessed, touched by miracle. Faith swells, banners are raised, monuments carved. Entire generations grow up in the shadow of victories that never truly belonged to them. But time is patient, and the Hydra is more patient still. Years later, the seeds planted within those gifts begin to grow. The rations carried toxins that bloom across bloodlines, weakening entire populations a generation later. The retreating enemy had not been broken, but redirected, allowed to grow stronger elsewhere, returning now with double the fury. The governor, who became a saint for leading his people through crisis, is revealed to have been an Alpha Legion operative, his legacy collapsing into betrayal that shatters not just his world, but the faith of all who looked to him. The monument carved to honor the miracle becomes a mark of shame, its stone toppled by the very people who once bowed before it. The Hydra gives, and the Imperium celebrates. Then the Hydra takes, and the celebration curdles into despair. This is the brilliance of their cruelty. The gifts are indistinguishable, from true miracles until the moment of collapse. The Imperium cannot refuse them. A regiment that has nothing left cannot discard supplies. A city surrounded cannot deny reinforcements. A fleet cut off from resupply cannot ignore an abandoned depot marked with the Aquila. To accept is survival. To refuse is death. And yet to accept is always to plant the seed of ruin. There is no choice. There is only the slow tightening of the coil. Some commanders attempt to resist. They burn supplies found in the field, even at the cost of starvation. They distrust retreating enemies, chasing them to confirm their destruction, only to be lured into traps. They question victories, demanding proof that never comes, earning suspicion from their superiors for their refusal to rejoice. Such men rarely live long. Commissars execute them for cowardice. Priests denounce them as faithless. The Hydra laughs, for even suspicion serves its plan. A commander who refuses to accept the Hydra's gift only isolates himself, making his death inevitable, his paranoia contagious. Among the ecclesiarchy, the Hydra's gift is more devastating still. Priests thunder about miracles, about the Emperor's hand shielding his faithful. Pilgrimages form, shrines swell with offerings, hymns echo across subs. When the truth arrives, that the miracle was Hydra design, that the survival was only bait, that the deliverance was deception, the faith does not simply falter, it fractures. Some believers turn rabid, insisting the lie was still divine, that the Emperor works through even traitors. Others abandon worship entirely, their prayers curdled into silence. The Hydra does not need to destroy faith. It only needs to poison it, so that the faithful destroy themselves. Even chaos is not spared. The Alpha Legion offers gifts to their supposed allies, leading warbands to prey they could never have reached, offering intelligence that delivers them quick victories. But those victories always rot. Rivals appear at their flanks. Cults they thought destroyed rise stronger than before. Demons they believed bound break free in the moment of triumph. The Hydra is loyal to nothing but its own design, and so its gifts are as false to allies as to enemies. The dark gods themselves cannot be sure whether the Hydra serves or mocks them. The most dreadful part of these gifts is that they rewrite memory. Once a victory is celebrated, it cannot be undone. Even when the truth is revealed, the story has already entered history. Records inscribe triumph. Shrines stand for decades. Songs are taught to children. By the time betrayal blooms, the victory cannot be erased without unraveling generations of belief. And so the Imperium finds itself chained to falsehoods it cannot abandon. Celebrating saints who were traitors, reciting hymns born from deception. The Hydra does not just win the moment, it wins the centuries that follow. Veterans whisper that the worst fate is not defeat, but deliverance. Defeat is simple, clean, honest in its cruelty. Deliverance, when it comes from the Hydra, is a blade hidden inside mercy. It is the rations that nourish today but poison tomorrow. It is the survival that ensures damnation. It is the miracle that ensures despair. To live by the Hydra's hand is to die by it, and the most terrible truth is that no one can ever know which gift they hold until it is too late. The Hydra's gift is not for the Imperium. It is not even for chaos. It is for itself, for a design larger than any single war. A gift today may be a ruin in a century. A victory today may be the foundation of betrayal generations later. No one can know. And so every triumph is suspect, every mercy poisoned, every miracle a mask. The Imperium celebrates its survival, erects its monuments, carves its names into stone. But somewhere, unseen, the Hydra coils tighter, smiling as it watches the seeds it planted take root. The first reports came as murmurs from astropaths, dismissed as exhaustion or the residue of psychic strain. They spoke of hearing their own voices echo back through the not distorted as warp echoes often are, but sharpened, clarified, repeating their thoughts with the subtlety of another mind pretending to be theirs. At first, these whispers were ignored. Astropaths hear countless horrors in the void between stars. Insanity is measured not by what they hear, but by what they choose to endure. Yet the pattern spread. Reports from across the Segmentum Ultima, then the Gothic sector. Then even Terra's most shielded choirs began to speak of voices that were not their own voices, that carried not madness, not demonic hunger, but intention. Navigators, too, began to falter. their charts filled with symbols that had no place in the currents of the warp. Where once they traced stable routes between beacons, now they saw shapes coiling through the star serpentine, overlapping, never still. Some claimed they saw Hydra's many heads rising and falling in the tides, always shifting, never truly there, yet unmistakable. Routes that should have been safe dissolved into storms, while paths that should have been death opened suddenly into calm seas. The Astronomicon still burned, but its guidance was shadowed by something else, something that suggested other hands had begun to write across the stars. Whether this was truth or paranoia ceased to matter. The effect was the same. Fleets delayed their voyages, captains hesitated at their helms, astropaths trembled as they carried orders. The Imperium depends on certainty in the warp, however fragile. When that certainty is fractured, when even the Emperor's light is haunted by reflections, the vast machinery of war grinds slower. Entire crusades stall. Reinforcements arrive late, or too early, or never at all. The Hydra coils not by destroying, but by making the warp itself a mirror where nothing can be trusted. The Inquisition, ever eager to brand heresy, declared the phenomenon a plague of demonic interference. Yet even they could not ignore the peculiar consistency of the visions. Demons shriek, they claw, they rend. But this was different. These were whispers with purpose, symbols repeated across star systems, a design woven into madness. Some inquisitors dared to speak the unspeakable, that the Alpha Legion had found a way to bleed into the Immaterium itself, not as sorcerers, not as warp-bound champions of chaos, but as infiltrators of perception. If true, then the Hydra's deception had transcended the material, twisting even the galaxy's unseen arteries into its labyrinth. And yet, the more rational voices argued, perhaps it was nothing more than paranoia. The Alpha Legion's greatest weapon has always been suggestion. If soldiers expect betrayal, they will find it. If officers expect manipulation, they will doubt every order. Why should the warp itself be any different? Perhaps the Hydra does not need to reach into the Immaterium at all. Perhaps all it must do is make mortals believe it has. Astropaths already live half in shadow. Navigators already see madness in the stars. A single seed planted in rumor could be enough to warp their visions into coils that were never there. But in war, belief shapes reality. A captain who believes the warp is compromised acts as if it is. Fleets scatter. Armies wither in isolation. Faith itself erodes. The Hydra wins not because it truly inhabits the warp, but because men believe it does. And belief, in the galaxy of the 41st millennium, is more powerful than fact. There are stories of entire ships lost, not to storms, but to hesitation. Navigators who refused to steer, convinced that the hydro coils in the tides meant doom. Astropaths who severed their own tongues, unwilling to carry messages they feared were reflections, not commands. Fleets turned upon themselves, captains accusing one another of receiving false orders, of speaking with Hydra voices. Some ships drift still, their crews starving, their navigators staring into the warp until their eyes bled, searching for heads in the coils of unreality. The most dreadful tales come from those who claim the Hydra speaks back, not in madness, not in raving storms, but in calm, deliberate words. An astropath calls for reinforcements and hears his own plea, repeated to him in perfect cadence. A navigator charts a path only to hear another voice whisper the coordinates before he can write them. These are not demonic tricks. They are too precise, too measured. They are imitations so flawless, they cannot be dismissed. And in that imitation lies the Alpha Legion's genius. For what is more terrifying than hearing your own voice command your destruction? The Ecclesiarchy, confronted with such reports, thundered that the Hydra could not touch the warp, that only the dark gods held dominion there. And yet even their sermons began to falter, because faith relies on certainty, and certainty evaporates when the stars themselves seem to coil into the shape of betrayal. Some preachers declared the visions to be tests of faith, the emperor permitting his servants to be tried by the Hydra's illusions. Others whispered darker thoughts, that perhaps the Alpha Legion's duplicity had infected even the light of the Astronomicon, whether real or imagined. The Hydra's reflection in the warp achieves the same end. The Immaterium, already a place of horror, becomes a place of doubt. The one space where certainty was most needed, where survival depended on clarity, becomes haunted by shadows of deception. The Hydra does not need to master the warp. It only needs to convince humanity that it might have. And once that seed is planted, every astropath's whisper, every navigator's sight, every captain's course becomes suspect. The warp itself becomes a mirror, and in every reflection, the Hydra smiles back. He called himself Lord Varakesh, and in the eyes of mortals, he was terror incarnate, a warlord clad in blackened plate, draped in trophies carved from 100 battlefields. His name spread like fire through the void. Worlds burned in his passage. Imperial fleets faltered at his command. Cults rose at his whisper. Entire regiments of the Astra Militarum broke beneath his assaults. He carved a dominion of ash across 3 sectors, and for a time, it seemed the dark gods themselves had crowned him favored. His warbands swelled with renegades, his banners carried by thousands who sought glory in his shadow. Yet glory has weight, and the heavier it grew, the more fragile it became. At first, the victories tasted true. Convoys fell to ambushes that seemed almost fated. Loyalist strongholds collapsed when their defenders fled in panic, leaving gates unbarred. Every step forward came too easily, but no warrior questions fortune when fortune smiles. Varakesh believed himself chosen, his path illuminated by chaos itself. He preached to his warriors that they were carving destiny with fire and bolter, that the Imperium crumbled because it could not match his genius. His pride became his banner, and thousands marched beneath it. But as the years lengthened, cracks appeared. He began to notice how often the enemy's movements aligned perfectly with his attacks, how supply lines he had never scouted appeared undefended at the exact moment he required them, how his enemies seemed to wither without battle, collapsing from within before his blade struck. Victories were his, yet none bore the mark of his hand. When he questioned his lieutenants, they swore by their blades that it was his genius guiding them. When he prayed to the dark gods, the answers came not as visions of fire and shadow, but as whispers measured, calm, deliberate. Whispers that did not praise him, but merely nudged him onward. It was during the siege of Meltrian Prime that the truth began to sharpen. The world was fortified beyond reason. Bastions dug into bedrock, void shields layered, orbital defenses bristling. By all rights, it should have been a slaughter. Yet when Varakesh's fleets emerged from the warp, the defenses were silent. Power grids had collapsed. The governor was already dead, assassinated by unseen hands. His armies walked unopposed into the throne halls of Meltrian, where they found only corpses, their blood still fresh. His banner was raised, but he felt no triumph. His warriors feasted, but their feasts rang hollow. For Varakesh knew he had not won this world. Someone else had delivered it to him. Paranoia spread like rot through his ranks. Whispers turned against him. Some claimed he had bargained with the Inquisition. Others swore he was no more than a puppet, his victories gifted rather than earned. His lieutenants eyed one another with suspicion, wondering who among them carried the Hydra's mark. And Varakesh himself began to doubt his own mind, replaying campaigns in memory, realizing he could not trace a single victory to his own blade. Always there had been circumstance, luck, coincidence threads, too neat, too deliberate. His genius was not his, it was borrowed. When the first betrayal came, he was not surprised. A lieutenant he had raised from obscurity turned his weapons upon him, declaring the warlord unworthy of devotion. Others followed, splintering into rival warbands, each convinced they had been chosen instead. Varakesh fought them, and he won, but each battle left him emptier. For in every ambush, in every mutiny, he saw the Hydra's smile. None of his enemies fought him with their own strength. They fought him with plans already written, paths already laid. He was thrashing inside a maze whose walls he had never seen. The final blow came not from war, but from revelation. In the ruins of a captured citadel, Varakish found records, vox logs, astropathic fragments, data slates marked in the shifting ciphers of the Alpha Legion. They spoke of campaigns decades old, each thread aligning perfectly with his so-called triumphs. Every victory had been predicted, every conquest mapped, long before his rise. He had never commanded an army. He had marched in step with orders delivered by ghosts. His banner was cloth raised over an illusion. His empire nothing more than a shadow stretched by unseen hands. His warriors sensed the truth before he spoke it. They deserted in waves, some fleeing into the void, others turning their guns upon their comrades. A legion without loyalty collapses faster than one destroyed by fire. Within months, Varakesh's dominion dissolved into scattered warbands, each carrying a fragment of his false glory. His name, once carved in fear, became a curse spoken only in mockery. Varakesh himself vanished. Some claim he sought vengeance, hunting the Alpha Legion across the stars. Though, how one hunts phantoms is a question without answer. Others whisper he bent the knee, acknowledging that he had never been more than a pawn, and choosing at last to serve his true masters. And some believe he still wages war in silence, his victories as hollow as ever, his life stretched into an endless spiral of battles, already written for him. This is the Hydra's genius, to give power to those who crave it most, to raise them high upon victories too perfect to be real, and then to let them see the strings binding their every act. It is not enough to kill a warlord. To unmake him, the Alpha Legion ensures he knows he was never real to begin with. The general without a legion becomes the cruelest of all their weapons, because his downfall destroys not only himself, but the faith of every warrior who once believed in him. The Hydra does not always kill with blades. Sometimes it kills with revelation. The war for Sarandal Secundus was supposed to end cleanly. It had begun with fire, with banners raised, with the shrieking thunder of artillery pounding heretic fortresses into dust. It had raged for years across hive spires and blasted plains, soldiers buried by the tens of thousands in nameless trenches, their sacrifice balanced against the promise that one day this world would be declared redeemed. And at last, after too many corpses to count, the final order came down the Vox chain: victory. The last redoubts broken, the enemy routed, the Imperial Aquila raised again over ruined towers. Administratum clerks sealed the documents. The Munitorum began preparing fresh levies. The Ecclesiarchy wrote sermons of triumph. An ending had been proclaimed, but the Alpha Legion never allows endings to exist. The unraveling began subtly. A data slate, bearing the final report, flickered, half its words dissolving into blank space. A regiment's record declared it annihilated in one column and decorated in another. A commissar's testimony changed with each retelling, first claiming he had led the decisive charge, then that another officer had, then denying any charge at all had occurred. Administratum clerks dismissed these as clerical faults, the usual detritus of war. But when they attempted to reconcile the contradictions, the records resisted. Entire slates wiped themselves clean. Parchment blackened without fire. Transcripts looped endlessly, never reaching their final lines. The survivors began to vanish. Troopers summoned for debriefing never arrived at their muster points. Their names were scrubbed from embarkation rolls. Officers who once stood proud before their men were suddenly absent, their very existence denied by archives that had carried their names only hours earlier. Some soldiers swore their comrades had simply walked away into the mist, never to return. Others claimed they saw men dissolve into nothingness, their shadows stretching into coils before the light swallowed them. The Hydra was not content to kill Badazit, was killing memory itself. Astropathic transmissions grew worse still. Final messages from the front ended mid-syllable, as though the speaker had been cut off in the act of uttering the truth. The most sacred orders, born across the warp by agony and fire, now arrived incomplete sentences without endings, proclamations without closure. Captains stared at these fragments with hollow eyes, their campaigns balanced on words that never finished. Was the war won? Was it lost? No one could say, because the last word was never spoken. The Inquisition tried to seize control, dispatching agents to secure what proof remained. They found only absence. Data crypts collapsed into static when queried. Cogitators refused to acknowledge the existence of Cyrandal Secundus at all. Witnesses grew ill or disappeared within hours of interrogation. Some inquisitors confessed that even their own memories faltered. They could recall the shape of battles, the weight of decisions, the ache of loss, but not the substance. Dates slipped from their minds. Names dissolved on their tongues. It was as if the Alpha Legion had not only erased records, but reached into the act of recollection itself. Unmaking the past from within, officers turned on their own men in desperation. Some executed aides they accused of falsifying reports. Others demanded impossible proof, begging their staff to prove the war had happened at all. When no proof could be produced, they broke. A general shot himself in his command chamber, his final note, no more than a string of unfinished words. Commissaires, once the iron hand of certainty, now looked at their regiments with suspicion, unable to tell whether the men they commanded were survivors or phantoms. Conjured by the Hydra's design, among the rank and file, despair spread like contagion. Soldiers who had once clung to their scars as proof of service now hid them, afraid that wounds from a war erased would mark them as tainted. In barracks and taverns, they whispered to each other of battles they remembered, but dared not speak of aloud. To mention Cyrandal Secundus in public was to invite accusations of heresy, or worse, that one had become a mouthpiece for the Hydra. The silence grew thicker than the ash still clinging to their armor. The ecclesiarchy pressed on, desperate to preserve meaning. They declared the campaign a triumph, erecting statues, composing hymns, but even their efforts fractured. On one world, priests proclaimed the Emperor had delivered his people from chaos. On another, they swore it had been Xenos. Elsewhere, they claimed there had been no war at all, only the purging of faithless governors disguised as a crusade. The shrines did not match, the sermons contradicted, the hymns jarred against each other. Faith, once unshakable, began to crack under the weight of discordant memory. This was the Hydra's victory, not to triumph in battle, but to deny the existence of victory altogether, to ensure that no ending could be written, that no one could claim certainty. The Alpha Legion did not need to deny the Imperium conquests. They only needed to deny it meaning. What use is triumph if no one remembers it? What comfort is survival if the proof of it vanishes? The Hydra had stolen not lives, but closure. Cyrandal Secundus remains in Imperial records, but never the same way twice. In some archives, it is listed as reclaimed, in others, lost. In still others, scoured by each version insists on its truth, and none can be reconciled. Which was real? Perhaps none, perhaps all. The survivors no longer know what they fought for, or why they bled, or whether the Emperor even saw them. They only know that something was taken from them, not their bodies, not their souls, but their endings. And so, the last word was never spoken. It hangs still, unfinished, echoing through vaults of silence. That silence is the Hydra's dominion, for nothing shatters loyalty so completely as the absence of an ending. The gnawing suspicion that everything endured has already been forgotten. The Alpha Legion does not endure because it is mighty. It endures because it cannot be fixed to a single meaning, where the World Eaters define themselves in slaughter, where the Death Guard rot in endless decay, where the Black Legion drapes itself in the certainty of domination. The Hydra refuses definition. It is loyalty and treachery, chaos and resistance, flesh and rumor, all at once. Its eternity is not in unbroken strength, but in the impossibility of being contained. To define the Alpha Legion is to misdefine it, and misdefinition is its shield. Consider the fate of memory. When an Imperial regiment marches under the Aquila, it does so believing in the purity of its cause. When a commissar enforces order, he does so believing that obedience leads to victory. These beliefs are certainties, certainties that turn flesh into weapons and suffering into sacrifice. Yet all it takes is a single Hydra whisper, a single fracture of contradiction, and certainty dissolves. Was the order truly from command, or was it an imitation seated in the Vox chain? Was the comrade beside you truly loyal, or an infiltrator who has lived as your brother for years? Such questions never leave once asked, and so the Hydra's eternity is carried, not in banners or armor, but in the doubts lodged in the human mind. This is why it cannot be destroyed. Destroy a fortress, and it is gone. Kill a warlord, and his body rots. Erase a name, and it may be forgotten. But a question lingers. A question breeds more questions. The Alpha Legion is not the sum of its operatives. It is the sum of the questions it leaves behind. To face them is to inherit those questions, and to inherit those questions is to perpetuate them. Every enemy of the Hydra becomes its vessel, whether they know it or not. The Imperium claims to rule by truth, the truth of the Emperor's divinity, the truth of heresy punished, the truth of loyalty sanctified. It survives not because its citizens are free, but because they believe these truths are beyond question. The Alpha Legion erodes this foundation without ever needing to topple it outright. It does not scream blasphemy. It whispers possibility. It makes men wonder if their loyalty serves the Emperor or the Hydra. It makes commanders question whether their victories are theirs or a design they cannot see. The Imperium can endure blood, famine, invasion, even the gnawing of demons at its edges. But doubt is a cancer it cannot purge. Some inquisitors argue that this is why Alpharius was the most dangerous of all the Primarchs. Not because of his strength, or even his guile, but because he understood the paradox of survival. The Hydra does not need to be remembered accurately. It thrives on being misremembered. It does not need to be victorious. It thrives when victory itself becomes indistinguishable from defeat. It does not need to be loved or hated. It thrives when it is both, when loyalty and betrayal are two faces of the same coin. In this paradox, it achieves immortality. There are those who whisper that Alpharius and Omegon themselves may be long dead, their bodies ash in forgotten dust. Yet what does death mean to a legion that has always worn masks? To declare them gone is meaningless, because their essence was never in their flesh but in their philosophy. Every Alpha Legionnaire can claim to be Alpharius, and in that claim, the Primarch lives. Every man who questions his orders carries a fragment of the Hydra, and in that doubt, the Primarchs endure. Death is irrelevant when the very idea of identity is fluid. The galaxy cannot excise them because the galaxy cannot agree on what they are. Are they traitors, bound to Tzeentch's coils of deceit? Are they hidden loyalists, still executing some buried plan whispered during the heresy? Are they neither, serving a doctrine older than chaos itself? Each answer is possible, each answer contradictory, and so the Hydra survives in the space between them. It cannot be pinned, cannot be defined, and so it cannot be destroyed. For the soldier, this eternity is personal. To fight the Alpha Legion is not to fear death, it is to fear that your life, your service, your suffering may not mean what you believe it does. To strike a Hydra warrior down is to wonder if you struck a traitor or a comrade. To hold the line is to wonder if your defense ensures victory for the Emperor or a design only the Hydra understands. The true cruelty is not in dying, but in never knowing what you died for. The Imperium thrives on certainty. The Hydra thrives on absence. And absence outlives certainty, because certainty can be disproved, but absence can never be filled. That is why, across millennia, the Alpha Legion remains. Not because its warriors are countless, but because its essence is uncertainty itself. It exists wherever records contradict, wherever orders falter, wherever men doubt one another. Its eternity is written not in blood, but in hesitation, so the galaxy turns. Endless war grinding onward, fleets rising and falling, banners raised and cast into flame, but beneath it all, the Hydra coils. Each act of defiance may be loyalty in disguise. Each act of loyalty may be treachery unseen. Each triumph may already be ruin, each ruin already part of triumph. The Alpha Legion does not need to answer. Its silence is enough, and thus the Hydra is eternal. Eternal not because it cannot be killed, but because it cannot be defined. Eternal not because it conquers, but because it leaves the galaxy unsure who it serves with every breath. Eternal because in every act of loyalty and in every act of defiance, the question lingers, was this for the Emperor or for the Hydra? And no one can ever know.